Chapter 2 continued. Ian Ryder hadn't died in any accident. What had killed him was plain to see, even to someone who'd never seen such a thing before. A spray of bullets had caught the car full on the driver's side, shattering the front tyre, smashing the windshield and side windows, and punching into the side panels. Alex ran his fingers over the holes. The metal felt cold against his flesh. He opened the door and looked inside. The front seat's pale grey leather was strewn with fragments of broken glass and stained with patches of dark brown. He didn't need to ask what the stain was. He could see everything. The flash of the machine gun, the bullets ripping into the car, Ian Ryder jerking in the driver's seat. But why? Why kill a bank manager? And why had the murder been covered up? It was the police who had delivered the news that night, so they must be part of it. Had they lied deliberately? None of it made sense. You should have got rid of it 2 days ago. Do it now. The machines must have stopped for a moment. If there hadn't been a sudden lull, Alex would never have heard the men coming. Quickly, he looked across the steering wheel and out of the other side. There were 2 of them, both dressed in loose-fitting overalls. Alex had a feeling he'd seen them before, at the funeral, and one of them was the driver, the man he'd seen with the gun. He was sure of it. Whoever they were only a few paces away from the car, talking in low voices. Another few steps and they would be there. Without thinking, Alex threw himself into the only hiding place available, inside the car itself. Using his foot, he hooked the door and closed it. At the same time, he became aware that the machines had started again, and he could no longer hear the men. He didn't dare look up. A shadow fell across the window as the 2 men passed, but then they were gone. He was safe. And then something hit the BMW with such force that Alex cried out. His whole body caught in a massive shockwave that tore him away from the steering wheel and threw him helplessly into the back. The roof buckled and 3 huge metal fingers tore through the skin of the car like a fork through an eggshell, trailing dust and sunlight. One of the fingers grazed the side of his head. Any closer and it would have cracked his skull. Alex yelled as blood trickled over his eye. He tried to move, then was jerked back a second time as the car was yanked off the ground and tilted high up in the air. He couldn't see. He couldn't move, but his stomach lurched as the car swung in an arc, the metal grinding and the lights spinning. The BMW had been picked up by the crane. It was going to be put inside the crusher with him inside. He tried to raise himself up, to wave through the windows, but the claw of the crane had already flattened the roof, pinning his left leg, perhaps even breaking it. He could feel nothing. He lifted a hand and managed to pound on the back window, but he couldn't break the glass. Even if the workmen were staring at the BMW, they would never see anything moving inside. His short flight across the junkyard ended with a bone-shattering crash as the crane deposited the car on the iron shelves of the crusher. Alex tried to fight back his sickness and despair and think of what to do. Any moment now, the operator would send the car tipping into the coffin-shaped trough. The machine was a Lefort shear, a slow-motion guillotine. At the press of a button, the 2 wings would close on the car with a joint pressure of 500 tons. The car, with Alex inside it, would be crushed beyond recognition, and the broken metal and flesh would then be chopped into sections. Nobody would ever know what had happened. He tried with all his strength to free himself, but the roof was too low. His leg was trapped. Then his world tilted and he felt himself falling into darkness. The shelves had lifted. The BMW slid to one side and fell the few yards into the trough. Alex felt the metalwork collapsing all around him. The back window exploded and glass showered around his head, dust and diesel fumes punching into his nose and eyes. There was hardly any daylight now, but looking out of the back, he could see the huge steel head of the piston that would push what was left of the car through the exit hole on the other side. The engine tone of the Lefort shear changed as it prepared for the final act. The metal wings shuddered. In a few seconds' time, the 2 of them would meet, crumpling the BMW like a paper bag. Alex pulled with all his strength and was astonished when his leg came free. It took him perhaps a second, one precious second, to work out what had happened. When the car had fallen into the trough, it had landed on its side. The roof had buckled again, just enough to free him. His hand scrabbled for the door, but of course that was useless. The doors were too bent. They would never open. The back window! With the glass gone, he could crawl through the frame, but only if he moved fast. The wings began to move. The BMW screamed as two walls of solid steel relentlessly crushed it. More glass shattered. One of the wheel axes snapped with the sound of a thunderbolt. Darkness began to close in. Alex grabbed hold of what was left of the back seat. Ahead of him he could see a triangle of light shrinking faster and faster. He could feel the weight of the two walls pressing down on him. The car was no longer a car, but the fist of some hideous monster snatching at the insect that Alex had become. With his strength, he surged forward. His shoulders passed through the triangle out into the light. Next came his legs. But at that last moment, his shoe caught on a piece of jagged metal. He jerked and the shoe was pulled off, falling back into the car. Alex heard the sound of the leather being squashed. Finally clinging to the black, oily surface of the observation platform at the back of the crusher, he dragged himself clear and managed to stand up. He found himself face to face with a man so fat that he could barely fit into the small cabin of the crusher. The man's stomach was pressed against the glass, his shoulders squeezed into the corner. A cigarette dangled on his lower lip as his mouth fell open and his eyes stared. What he saw was a boy in the rags of what had once been a school uniform. A whole sleeve had been torn off his arm, streaked with blood and oil, hung limply by his side. By the time the operator had taken all of this in, Alex had come to his senses and turned the machine off. The boy had gone. Alex clambered down the side of the crusher, landing on the foot that still had a shoe. He was aware now of the pieces of jagged metal lying everywhere. If he wasn't careful, he would cut open the other foot. His bicycle was where he'd left it, leaning against the wall, and gingerly, half hopping, he made for it. Behind him he heard the cabin of the crusher open, and a man's voice called out, raising the alarm. At the same time, a second man ran forward, stopping between Alex and his bike. It was the driver, the man he'd seen at the funeral. His face twisted into a hostile frown, was curiously ugly, greasy hair, watery eyes and pale, lifeless skin. "What do you think?" he began. His hand slid into his jacket. Alex remembered the gun and instantly, without even thinking, swung into action. He'd started learning karate when he was 6 years old. With one afternoon, with no explanation, Ian Ryder had taken him to a local club for his first lesson, and he'd been going there once a week ever since. Over the years, he'd passed through the various student grades, but it was only the year before that he'd become a first grade Dan, a black belt. When he'd arrived at Brooklyn School, his gentle looks and accent had quickly brought him to the attention of the school bullies, 3 hulking 16-year-olds. They'd cornered him once behind the bike shed. The encounter lasted less than a minute. The next day, one of the bullies had left Brooklyn, and the other 2 had never troubled anyone again. Now Alex brought up one leg, twisted his body around and lashed out. The back kick is said to be the most lethal in karate. His foot powered into the man's abdomen with such force that the man didn't even have time to cry out. His eyes bulged and his mouth half opened in surprise. Then, with his hand still halfway into his jacket, he crumpled to the ground. Alex jumped over him, snatched up his bike and swung himself onto it. In the distance, a third man was running behind him. He heard the single word, "Stop!" called out. Then there was a crack and a bullet whipped past him. Alex gripped the handlebars and pedalled as hard as he could. The bike shot forward over the rubble and out through the gates. He took one look over his shoulder. Nobody had followed him. With one shoe on and one shoe off, his clothes in rags and his body streaked with oil, Alex knew he must look a strange sight, but then he thought back to his last seconds inside the crusher and sighed with relief. He could be looking a lot worse.